She demanded I move my boat, the one tangible piece of sanity I brought back from years of service, for absolutely no legitimate reason other than her own misplaced sense of authority. So I did exactly what she asked, just not quite how she expected. And yes, it culminated in a situation where her position on the board was hanging by a thread, all because she couldn't stand the sight of something that reminded her someone else had lived a life beyond matching mailbox standards. Drop a comment if you've ever had to school an HOA power tripper. You'll appreciate where this goes. It all started about 6 months after I'd moved into what I thought was going to be my quiet slice of post-military peace. Bought a modest house in a decent subdivision, nothing fancy, but it was mine. Close enough to the water for weekend escapes, far enough from the relentless noise of my previous life. My boat wasn't huge, just a reliable 20-foot rigid inflatable, a Zodiac-style craft. Sturdy, practical, maybe not the gleaming fiberglass monstrosity some folks prefer, but it had served me well on coastal training exercises and felt like an extension of me. It lived on its trailer, parked neatly on the designated concrete pad beside my garage, fully compliant with the initial copy of the HOA covenants. Conditions, restrictions, CC rupees, I received at closing. I'd specifically checked. Boat parking was allowed on approved side yard pads, provided it was maintained and didn't block sidewalks. Mine was immaculate, cover always on, tires properly inflated, hull cleaner than Brenda's perpetually judging eyes. For the first few months, life was blissfully unremarkable. I kept to myself mostly, exchanged polite nods with neighbors, enjoyed the quiet evenings. Then Brenda ascended to the throne, or rather, got elected HOA president. Brenda lived 3 houses down, a woman whose lawn was suspiciously perfect and whose primary hobby appeared to be patrolling the streets in her golf cart, clipboard in hand, looking for infractions only she could see. She radiated that particular brand of entitled displeasure, common among those who peak by controlling mailbox colors and lawn height. Our first direct interaction was predictably unpleasant. She rolled up one Saturday morning while I was rinsing down the boat after a fishing trip. "Excuse me," she'd called out, her voice carrying that sharp edge that sets your teeth on edge. "That thing. It's really quite an eyesore, isn't it?" I paused, hose in hand, giving her a measured look. "It's a boat, Brenda. And no, I think it looks functional," she sniffed, peering at the subdued gray hull and black inflatable tubes. "It just doesn't fit the aesthetic of our community. We have standards, you know. All the other boats here are, well, nicer." I mentally translated nicer to more expensive and less practical. "It fits the standards laid out in the CC/Rs," I replied calmly, turning back to my work. "It's parked legally on my property." Brenda wasn't deterred. "Well, perhaps the rules need updating. It looks terribly military." She said military, like it was a disease. That was the first spark. After everything, after years spent serving so people like Brenda could argue about lawn furniture and safety, to have that service used as a pejorative? It rankled more than I expected. "It's a boat, Brenda," I repeated, my voice a little tighter. "Its service history, or lack thereof in this civilian context, is irrelevant. It's compliant." She pursed her lips. "We'll see about that," she muttered, marking something on her clipboard before driving off in her chariot of minor tyranny. I knew, right then, this wasn't going to be a one-off conversation. This was going to be her project. The first official salvo arrived a week later, a crisp white envelope with the HOA logo, delivered via certified mail, no less. Inside was a violation notice. Violation: unapproved watercraft visible from street. It cited a clause about maintaining community aesthetic harmony and demanded the boat be removed from public view within 14 days or face fines. Fines starting at $50 a day. There was no mention of which specific rule was violated regarding approved parking. Only this vague aesthetic clause, often used as a catch-all cudgel by overzealous boards. I immediately pulled out my copy of the CC/Rs and the plot plan for my property. Page 47, Section 8, Subsection C. Recreational vehicles, including boats on trailers, may be parked on a designated paved side yard pad approved by the Architectural Review Committee, ARC, provided they are maintained in good condition and do not obstruct pedestrian access. My pad was part of the original house plan, approved years ago. The boat was immaculate. It obstructed nothing. The aesthetic harmony clause was notoriously subjective, and according to online HOA forums, often legally unenforceable if applied arbitrarily, especially against pre-approved structures and compliant vehicles. Brenda wasn't just wrong. She was wielding a clause like a weapon without understanding its limitations. My first step was calm, documented communication. I drafted a polite but firm response letter. I included photographs of the boat on its pad, clearly showing its condition and location. I cited the specific CC/R clause allowing its parking. I attached a copy of my property plot plan showing the approved pad. I pointed out that aesthetic harmony was subjective and could not supersede specific permissions clearly outlined in the governing documents. I sent my response via certified mail, return receipt requested, creating a paper trail. Silence for a week. Then, another letter. Second notice. Failure to comply. This time, the tone was sharper. It claimed my interpretation of the rules was incorrect and that the board retained ultimate authority on aesthetic matters. The fines were reiterated, with the clock ticking. Brenda wasn't backing down. She was doubling down. I started talking to my immediate neighbors. One, an older gentleman named George, who'd lived there for 20 years, just chuckled. Brenda? Yeah, she gets like this. Usually picks one thing a season to obsess over. Last year, it was recycling bins left out an hour too late. Another neighbor, Sarah, a young mom, lowered her voice. Honestly, your boat looks fine. Better than Bob's rusting RV down the street, but Brenda seems to have a thing about you. A thing about me? Or a thing about the boat? Or maybe a thing about the veteran who wasn't intimidated? I suspected it was a cocktail of all three. The fact that I wasn't immediately capitulating seemed to fuel Brenda's resolve. She wanted compliance, unquestioning obedience. She wasn't getting it. It was time to escalate my own strategy. I wasn't just going to defend, I was going to understand the battlefield, the HOA's inner workings, better than Brenda herself. This meant diving deep into not just the CC/Rs, but the bylaws, minutes from past meetings, state statutes governing HOAs, everything. I had long nights of navigating poorly designed HOA websites and cross-referencing arcane documents ahead of me, fueled by coffee and a growing sense of righteous indignation. Brenda thought this was about a boat. I was starting to realize it was about challenging unchecked, petty authority, and that was a mission I understood far too well. My boat wasn't just a boat anymore, it was becoming a symbol. My deep dive into the HOA documentation was illuminating. It turns out, our HOA wasn't just run by Brenda's whims. There was a whole structure, albeit one she seemed to dominate. There were supposed to be monthly board meetings, open to residents, with minutes published. Reading through the past year's minutes was like watching a slow-motion power grab. Brenda, initially the secretary, had maneuvered her way to the presidency after the previous president moved away. Attendance at meetings was abysmal, usually just the board members, Brenda, a perpetually flustered treasurer named Stan, and a quiet older woman named Carol who seemed to vote with Brenda on everything, and maybe one or two residents with specific complaints. Decisions were often made with minimal discussion, noted simply as motion passed. The Architectural Review Committee, mentioned in the rule about my boat pad, hadn't actually met or approved anything in months, according to the records. Brenda seemed to be making ARC decisions unilaterally under the guise of the board president's authority. This was sloppy, and potentially a violation of their own bylaws, which required specific committee approvals for aesthetic enforcement. The bylaws clearly stated that enforcement actions based on subjective clauses like aesthetic harmony required a documented ARC review process, including comparisons to community standards not just the president's personal taste. Brenda hadn't followed any of that procedure. She just sent the letters. This procedural error was my first concrete piece of leverage, beyond simply citing the permissive parking rule. I kept digging. I spent hours online, researching Florida statutes governing HOAs. Chapter 720 was my new best friend. It outlined specific requirements for notice periods, fine structures, dispute resolution, and board responsibilities. It also enshrined homeowners' rights to display military flags, which made Brenda's too military comment about the boat even more grating, though my boat wasn't flying any flags. Importantly, the statute emphasized that rules had to be applied consistently and fairly. Was Brenda targeting other boats or RVs? I took a slow drive around the entire neighborhood one evening, camera phone ready. Sure enough, I documented at least 3 other boats, 2 fairly large RVs, and a commercial van with business lettering, all parked visibly on driveways or side pads. Bob's RV, which Sarah had mentioned, was indeed looking a bit worse for wear, with faded paint and slightly deflated tires. Yet, according to George, Bob hadn't received any notices recently. Selective enforcement? It certainly looked that way. This was gold. Arbitrary or selective enforcement is a huge legal vulnerability for HOAs. I saved the time-stamped photos, noting the addresses. My documentation folder was growing thicker. I wasn't just building a defense, I was building a case against Brenda's management style. Meanwhile, the 3rd notice arrived. Final notice. Intent to fine and lien. The language was more aggressive. Fines were now accruing daily, retroactively from the original deadline. It threatened placing a lien on my property if the fines weren't paid, and the violation, my legally parked boat, wasn't cured. This was serious. An HOA lien could complicate future sales or refinancing. Brenda wasn't just being annoying anymore. She was actively trying to harm me financially and impact my property rights over a boat she simply didn't like. Anger turned into cold resolve. This wasn't about the $50 a day. It was about the principle. It was about someone abusing a position of minor authority to bully a resident, a veteran, based on personal prejudice. My training kicked in. Assess the threat, gather intelligence, identify weaknesses, formulate a counter-offensive. I reached out to a contact, a buddy from my service days, who was now a paralegal specializing in real estate law. I laid out the situation, shared my documentation, the CC, Rs, the letters, the photos of other vehicles, the procedural lapses I'd found in the minutes. His response was quick and validating. "Man, she's way out over her skis on this one," he texted back after reviewing the docs. "The selective enforcement is blatant. The procedural errors on ARC are clear violations of their own rules. The aesthetic harmony clause, used this way, is weak tea, especially against a specific permissive rule. You've got her." He advised drafting a formal dispute letter citing the specific statutes, the CC/R clauses, the bylaw violations, and the evidence of selective enforcement. He also suggested demanding formal dispute resolution as outlined in the state statutes, which usually involved mediation before escalating to liens or lawsuits. And, he added, start attending those HOA meetings. Make her see you. Make her justify this in front of everyone, even if it's just Stan and Carol. Put her on the spot. Attending the meetings was a great idea. It would allow me to observe Brenda in her natural habitat, gauge the other board members' attitudes, and potentially rally other discontented residents, if any existed. My plan was forming. Send the formal dispute letter, halt the fine clock, force mediation if necessary, and simultaneously start applying pressure publicly at the meetings. But I also had another idea brewing, something inspired by Brenda's core complaint: the boat's visibility. She wanted it moved? Fine, I'd move it, but not into storage, not off my property. Oh no, I had a much more strategically appropriate location in mind. A location that was, according to my detailed map of the neighborhood and my understanding of the common areas, perfectly legal and perfectly positioned to maximize Brenda's personal discomfort. The game was truly on. The formal dispute letter I sent was a masterpiece of polite, legalistic smackdown. It ran 4 pages, meticulously citing chapter and verse, Florida Statute 720 detailing notice requirements and dispute resolution rights, the HOA's own CC.R. Section 8. Subsection C, permitting the boat. Bylaw Article 5, requiring ARC review for aesthetic enforcement, contrasting it with the lack of documented ARC meetings or findings regarding my property. And finally, the documented evidence, complete with dated photographs and addresses, of other, arguably less maintained recreational vehicles and commercial vans being parked with impunity throughout the neighborhood, demonstrating clear selective enforcement. The letter formally invoked my right to pre-suit mediation under state law if the board continued its course of action, demanded the immediate cessation of all fines, and requested written confirmation that the violation notice was rescinded. I sent copies not just to the HOA's official P.O. box, but addressed individually to Brenda, Stan, and Carol via certified mail. I wanted everyone on notice. I wanted Stan, the treasurer, and Carol, the quiet voter, to know exactly what Brenda was doing in their name and the potential legal quagmire she was leading them into. The effect was almost immediate. No more letters arrived threatening liens. Instead, about 10 days later, I received a terse email from the generic HOA board address, simply stating that the matter was under review by the board and that fine accrual was paused pending review. A small victory, but a crucial one. They were blinking. Now, for the second phase of the operation, moving the boat. My research hadn't just focused on rules about my own property. I'd also studied the rules regarding common areas and parking. Our neighborhood had several small common area plots, mostly decorative landscaping, but also 2 designated overflow guest parking areas, paved and marked. According to the rules, these spots were available for short-term parking, defined as up to 72 consecutive hours, primarily for guests, but not explicitly forbidden for resident use if space permitted. Crucially, one of these overflow parking zones, containing about 6 spots, was located directly across the street and about 50 feet down from Brenda's own meticulously manicured front yard. Her house sat on a slight corner, giving her a prime view of this particular common area. During my reconnaissance, I'd noted these spots were rarely full, usually only seeing 1 or 2 cars even on weekends. Moving my boat there wouldn't deprive actual guests of parking. The plan was simple, bordering on devious. I wasn't going to park it there permanently, violating the 72-hour rule. I was going to rotate it. Every weekend, starting Friday evening, I'd hitch up my boat and move it from my side yard pad to one of those prime spots directly in Brenda's line of sight. Come Sunday evening, before the 72-hour limit expired, I'd move it back to my perfectly legal, perfectly compliant side yard pad. It complied with her demand to move it from its current location. It complied with the 72-hour rule for the guest parking. It was perfectly legal. And it would put my terribly military eyesore directly in her face every single weekend. The sheer, unadulterated pettiness of it delighted me in a way I hadn't felt since pulling off a particularly challenging training evolution. The first Friday after receiving the under review email, I executed the maneuver, hooked up the trailer, drove slowly down the street, and backed the boat perfectly into a spot facing Brenda's house. I took my time unhitching it, checked the tire chocks, made sure the cover was secure. I could almost feel her eyes burning into my back from behind her pristine window blinds. As I walked back to my house, I saw a flicker of movement. The blinds snapped shut. Oh, this was going to be good. Sunday evening, like clockwork, I retrieved it. Rinse and repeat the following Friday. The weekend boat relocation went on for about a month, a silent, perfectly legal protest unfolding under Brenda's nose. I imagined her stewing, clipboard idle, robbed of her primary target yet constantly reminded of her failure. Her power was based on intimidation and the perceived weight of HOA rules. By following the rules to the letter, yet in a way specifically designed to annoy her, I was undermining that power structure. Meanwhile, I started attending the monthly HOA meetings held in the clubhouse community room. Just as my paralegal buddy suggested, my presence alone seemed to throw Brenda off kilter. The first meeting I attended, there were only 5 people present: the 3 board members, Brenda, Stan, Carol, and one other resident complaining about a neighbor's dog barking. When I walked in and took a seat, Brenda visibly stiffened. Stan nervously shuffled papers. Carol stared straight ahead. The meeting proceeded with tedious updates on landscaping contracts and pool maintenance schedules. Brenda conducted the meeting with an air of forced efficiency, but I noticed her glancing my way repeatedly. During the open forum section at the end, I didn't even bring up the boat issue directly. I simply introduced myself as a relatively new resident, mentioned my address, and asked a simple, seemingly innocuous question about the process for accessing past ARC meeting minutes. Citing my interest in understanding community architectural standards, Brenda's response was telling. "Those records are maintained?" She stammered slightly. "If you have a specific query, you can submit it in writing to the board." She was clearly uncomfortable, likely realizing I was aware of the ARC's inactivity. Stan looked down at his notes, and even Carol shifted in her seat. My mere presence and pointed question had subtly shifted the dynamics. I was no longer just a name on a violation notice. I was a resident, present, informed, and asking questions they might not want to answer publicly. The second meeting I attended, a couple more residents showed up, perhaps drawn by a notice about a potential dues increase. Again, I watched Brenda run the show. This time, during the open forum, another resident asked about the status of enforcing rules against improperly parked commercial vehicles, mentioning a specific plumbing van that was often parked overnight down the street. Brenda became defensive. "We address violations as they are reported and verified," she stated coolly. "The board handles enforcement consistently." This was my opening. "Brenda," I interjected calmly but clearly, "speaking of consistent enforcement, I'd appreciate an update on the review of the violation notice issued for my boat several weeks ago. The one alleging it violated aesthetic harmony despite being parked per CC, R Section 8, subsection C." All eyes turned to Brenda. Her face flushed slightly. "That matter is still under internal review," she said tightly. "As I mentioned previously, fine accrual is paused." "Understood," I replied, maintaining an even tone. However, I did provide extensive documentation, including evidence of numerous other potentially non-compliant vehicles, like the commercial van Mr. Henderson just mentioned, and Bob's RV down the street, none of which appear to have received similar notices. Could the board clarify its criteria for prioritizing aesthetic enforcement actions to ensure fairness and transparency as required by state law? The room was quiet. Stan looked like he wanted to disappear. Carol was studying her fingernails intently. Brenda glared at me. "The board applies the rules uniformly," she insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. "Each case is evaluated individually. Perhaps the ARC minutes would shed light on these evaluations." I pressed gently. "Could the board confirm when the ARC last formally convened to evaluate aesthetic compliance cases like mine?" Brenda's lips thinned. "Meeting schedules are complex. We follow procedures." It was a non-answer, and everyone in the room knew it. The other residents were now looking back and forth between us, sensing the tension. The seed of doubt about Brenda's competence and fairness had been planted. She clearly wasn't used to being challenged, especially not with factual references to the governing documents and state law in a public forum. After the meeting, Stan, the treasurer, actually approached me nervously as I was leaving. "Look," he mumbled, avoiding eye contact, "Brenda can be enthusiastic about the rules." "Enthusiastic?" I echoed, raising an eyebrow. "Or selective and exceeding her authority. Stan, the way this has been handled opens the entire HOA up to potential legal challenges. You're the treasurer. You should be concerned about the financial implications of defending arbitrary enforcement actions, especially when clear procedural rules from the bylaws are being ignored." Stan paled visibly. I've mentioned process," he stammered. "Brenda handles the violation notices, but the board is collectively responsible, Stan. I reminded him gently but firmly. Ignoring the bylaws and state statutes isn't a sustainable strategy. I left him standing there, looking troubled. Brenda's grip on the board seemed less absolute than I initially feared. Stan was clearly worried. And maybe, just maybe, persuadable. The weekend boat rotations continued, a visual reminder of the ongoing conflict right outside Brenda's window. She never confronted me about it directly, likely because she knew it was technically legal, but I often saw her golf cart parked conspicuously near the guest spots, as if monitoring my compliance with the 72-hour rule. Let her watch. Every time I moved it back to my side pad on Sunday, I felt a small pulse of satisfaction. The tide was turning, slowly but surely. My strategy wasn't just about defending my right to park my boat. It was about exposing Brenda's mismanagement. And her obsessive focus on my boat was giving me all the ammunition I needed. The pressure was building, and I sensed the confrontation was nearing its climax. The breaking point came about 2 months into my campaign of malicious compliance and public questioning. Perhaps it was the constant weekend spectacle of my boat appearing across from her house, or the growing unease among the other board members, or the dawning realization that I wasn't going away. But Brenda snapped. It wasn't a dramatic public meltdown, not initially. It was quieter, more insidious. She couldn't get me on the boat directly anymore, thanks to my formal dispute and her lack of procedural follow-through, so she started looking for other leverage, anything to make my life difficult. First came a petty notice about my lawn edging. Apparently, a 3-foot section along the sidewalk wasn't quite ruler straight enough for her exacting standards. I fixed it, took time-stamped photos before and after, and sent a polite email confirming compliance. Then came a complaint about my trash cans being visible from the street for 2 hours before the allowed put-out time the evening before pickup. Again, I adjusted my routine slightly, documented it. It was harassment, pure and simple, transparent attempts to find something, anything, that would stick. She was trying to drown me in minor paperwork and nitpicking, likely hoping I'd either give up, make a mistake, or just move away. But she underestimated my resolve, and frankly, my tolerance for bureaucratic absurdity, honed by years of military service. Dealing with nonsensical regulations was practically a core competency. I documented every single notice, every communication, building an even thicker file, detailing a clear pattern of harassment, following my challenge to her authority regarding the boat. The other residents were noticing, too. George stopped me one afternoon while I was, ironically, meticulously edging my lawn. "Heard Brenda's got you on the landscaping now? She's really got it in for you, son. Doesn't look good, her picking on a veteran like that." His comment reinforced something crucial. Brenda's actions weren't just annoying me. They were potentially damaging the HOA's reputation and alienating other residents who might sympathize with my situation, especially the veteran angle, which Brenda seemed so disdainful of, yet clearly resonated with others like George. This growing discontent was exactly what I needed for the next phase, leveraging her misconduct not just to protect myself, but to potentially remove her from power. The threatened to fire aspect wasn't about her actual job, but her volunteer position as HOA president. My research into the bylaws had revealed a process for removing a board member for cause, which included failure to uphold the governing documents or acting in a manner detrimental to the association. It required a petition signed by a certain percentage of homeowners or a majority vote of the remaining board members, followed by a special meeting. Brenda's documented procedural failures with the ARC, her clear selective enforcement, and now this pattern of targeted harassment provided ample grounds for failure to uphold the governing documents and acting detrimentally. The challenge was getting the required support. I decided to focus on Stan and Carol first. I requested a private meeting with them, framing it as a concerned homeowner wanting to discuss the board's potential legal exposure due to recent enforcement actions. We met at a neutral coffee shop outside the neighborhood. I laid out my case calmly and rationally, presenting my documentation, the initial boat letters versus the CC/R bylaws, the photos of other unenforced violations, the log of subsequent petty notices I'd received after challenging Brenda, the lack of ARC minutes, and printouts of the relevant Florida statutes on HOA responsibilities and homeowner rights. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," I said sincerely, looking directly at Stan and then Carol. "I just want to be treated fairly and according to the rules we all agreed to live by. But the current approach, spearheaded by Brenda, is violating those rules. It's exposing the HOA, and by extension all of us homeowners, to potential lawsuits, legal fees, and special assessments to cover costs. Her focus on my boat, and now these retaliatory notices, isn't about maintaining standards. It seems personal, and it's poor governance." Stan squirmed. "I've told Brenda we need to be careful." Carol, surprisingly, spoke up. "My husband was in the Navy," she said quietly, looking at me. "He keeps his fishing boat in the garage, but it doesn't seem right what she's doing, especially if the rules do allow it." Bingo. An appeal to shared experience and fairness. "It just needs to stop," I continued. "The violations against me need to be rescinded, and the board needs to commit to following proper procedure and applying rules fairly to everyone. If Brenda can't or won't do that, then for the good of the community, perhaps she isn't the right person to lead the board." I let that hang in the air. I didn't explicitly demand they vote her out right then, but the implication was clear. I had the evidence to initiate a formal removal process, via petition if necessary. But ideally, the board could correct itself internally. Stan looked genuinely worried now, probably calculating potential legal costs. Carol looked thoughtful, perhaps reconsidering her allegiance to Brenda. "Will, we need to discuss this," Stan finally said. "Internally, as a board." That was all I could ask for at that moment. I had presented the smoking gun evidence, the pattern of behavior, the procedural violations, directly to the other decision-makers. The metaphorical threat wasn't a shouted ultimatum, but the unavoidable consequence laid bare. Brenda's actions were jeopardizing the HOA, and if they didn't rein her in or remove her, I had the grounds and the resolve to force the issue, potentially dragging the HOA into a costly and embarrassing public fight they were likely to lose. Checkmate was in sight. The fallout from my meeting with Stan and Carol wasn't immediate fireworks, but a tangible shift in the atmosphere. The petty violation notices stopped abruptly. My boat continued its weekend migrations to the guest parking spot opposite Brenda's house, a silent testament to the ongoing standoff. But the administrative harassment ceased. It seemed Stan and Carol had managed to convey the seriousness of the situation to Brenda, or perhaps the fear of formal removal proceedings was enough to make her pause her direct attacks on me. However, the original boat violation notice still hadn't been officially rescinded. It was just paused. That wasn't good enough. I needed full resolution, not just a temporary ceasefire dictated by Brenda's fluctuating mood or strategic retreats. The upcoming annual homeowners meeting, where board elections were sometimes held and major issues discussed, seemed like the perfect venue for a final showdown. Unlike the sparsely attended monthly meetings, the annual meeting usually drew a larger crowd, concerned about budgets, dues, and board governance. I spent the weeks leading up to it, subtly sharing my experiences with a few more neighbors I trusted, including George and Sarah. I didn't distribute my entire dossier, but I mentioned the selective enforcement, the procedural issues I'd uncovered, and the retaliatory nitpicking, framing it as a concern about fair governance for everyone. George, bless his heart, became a quiet advocate, mentioning my situation to others he knew who had also felt targeted by Brenda's arbitrary rule interpretations in the past. By the time the annual meeting arrived, there was a palpable buzz in the community room, which was more crowded than I'd ever seen it. Brenda, Stan, and Carol sat at the front table, Brenda looking unusually strained, clutching her agenda like a shield. Stan looked miserable. Carol looked impassive but watchful. After the usual budgetary presentations and committee reports, most of which were glossed over quickly, the floor was opened for homeowner concerns. Several people aired typical grievances, parking issues, landscaping quality. Then George stood up. "I've lived here 20 years, he began, his voice steady. "And I've seen boards come and go. Most try to be fair. But lately, I'm concerned about how rules are being applied. Seems like some folks get notices for tiny things, while bigger issues get ignored. We need consistency. We need fairness. We need board members who treat everyone with respect, especially those who've served our country," he finished, pointedly looking towards me, then back at the board. A murmur of agreement went through the room. Sarah then spoke up, mentioning the difficulty in getting clear answers from the board about ARC guidelines and inconsistent enforcement regarding things like kids' play equipment. Others chimed in with similar stories of confusing or seemingly arbitrary notices. The narrative was shifting from individual complaints to a pattern of poor management. Finally, I raised my hand. Brenda reluctantly called on me. I stood up, holding my file. Like many of you, I started, keeping my voice calm and measured. I chose this community hoping for peace and fair treatment. Unfortunately, my experience over the past few months has been concerning, specifically regarding the handling of a violation notice for my boat. I quickly summarized the timeline. The initial vague notice, my documented proof of compliance with specific CCR rules, the board's failure to follow its own bylaws regarding ARC review, the clear evidence of selective enforcement compared to other vehicles, and the subsequent string of petty, retaliatory notices I received only after challenging the initial false violation. I didn't present every single document, but I held up the file. I have meticulously documented every step, I stated, making eye contact with Brenda, then Stan, then Carol. The bylaws require fair and consistent application of the rules. State law requires proper procedures for violations and disputes. The actions taken against me failed on all these counts. Furthermore, the pattern of harassment following my request for due process raises serious questions about the current leadership's judgment and fitness to serve. I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. I formally requested months ago that the baseless violation notice against my boat be rescinded. It hasn't been. Tonight, I ask the board, in front of this community, to finally do the right thing. Rescind the violation, clear my record, and commit publicly to following the established procedures and state laws for all residents, ensuring fair and transparent governance moving forward. I then addressed Stan and Carol directly. Stan, Carol, you are aware of the specifics, the documentation, the potential legal and financial risks the current approach creates for all of us homeowners. Will you ensure this is resolved correctly and that such arbitrary actions cease? The spotlight was fully on them. Brenda started to sputter. This is highly irregular. Personal grievances shouldn't dominate the annual meeting. But Stan cut her off, looking flustered but resolute. He's right, Brenda. He turned to the audience. There have been procedural issues. We have reviewed Mr. Cooper's documentation. The board needs to rectify this. He looked at me. The violation notice concerning your boat will be officially rescinded, effective immediately. We apologize for the errors in handling this. Carol nodded silently in agreement. Brenda looked absolutely thunderstruck, betrayed by her own board members in public. A wave of murmurs turned into applause from a significant portion of the homeowners. It wasn't just my victory, it felt like a collective release of frustration. But it wasn't quite over. Another homeowner stood up. Given these procedural issues and clear evidence of mismanagement and what sounds like targeted harassment, maybe we should discuss the current board leadership? The bylaws allow for removal for cause. Perhaps it's time for a change. The suggestion hung in the air. Brenda went pale. This was the culmination of the threat. Not a direct threat from me, but the natural consequence of her actions being exposed. Stan immediately moved to table that discussion for a future specific meeting, likely wanting to avoid an immediate public execution. But the message was clear. Brenda's authority was shattered. Her position was incredibly precarious, relying now only on Stan and Carol choosing not to formally vote her out later. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. As the meeting adjourned, several neighbors came up to shake my hand or offer quiet words of support. George gave me a thumbs up. Sarah smiled. Well done, she said. Walking home that night, past the guest parking spot where my boat wouldn't need to be parked next weekend, I felt a profound sense of relief and vindication. It wasn't just about the boat anymore. It was about standing up to a bully, using knowledge and procedure as weapons, and ultimately, restoring a small measure of fairness to my little corner of the world. Brenda wanted me to move my boat? I did, in a way. I moved it right out of the crosshairs of her power trip and, in the process, helped move her closer to the exit door of her HOA reign. That's the kind of relocation I can definitely live with. And the boat? It stayed exactly where it belonged, on its pad, a silent monument to the battle won.